I wanted to talk a little bit about museums today. I know that a lot of you folks here have probably seen your fair share of incredibly prestigious museums here. We've got a few New Yorkers in the crowd, right? We have some New Yorkers here, right? Okay, so I'm sure if you're a New Yorker, you've probably been to the Met, or to the Museum of Natural History, or to the Rubin, or God knows how many huge museums there are in New York City. But anyways, I wanted to talk a little bit about museums, and this is going to be a little bit different than my usual presentations in that it's not strictly speaking history. So a lot of my previous talks have been about like the history of the Mughal Empire or the English Civil War, right? It's very strictly speaking history and a narrative that goes with that. This is a little bit different. This is going to be some history as well, but also ethics. I want this presentation to kind of provoke questions of right and wrong. And in this case, questions of right and wrong when it comes to museums today that possess stolen antiquities in their collections. And I want to be very clear right up front. I do not have time to talk about every single stolen object in every single prestigious museum in Europe and the United States. We could be here for months if that were the case. So I'm narrowing it down to a pretty broad sense of the term. I'll focus for a bit on the British Museum, just because they have the most public information and their objects' histories are, how do I say this politely, dubious. But I don't obviously have the time to go into every single instance of a museum getting caught up in some kind of public controversy for its possession of stolen antiquities. So I hope that kind of gives people a rough look of the talk I'm about to give. Is it clear, I hope? All right, marvelous. Okay, so I'm going to start off as I like to always start off with a little bit of context. So, I'm sure many of you are probably already aware of this, if you've been around. But today, antiquities, which for those of you who don't quite know, are, well, how do I say this somewhat romantically, relics from bygone times that can tell us things about the past. That sounds kind of corny, but that's the best term I can come up with. Largely from the global south, and when I say the global south, I do mean Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Throughout the course of the last probably 250, 300 years, have been taken and enshrined in museums in Europe and in the United States and the rest of the Western world on a shocking scale. When I first started looking into this, I didn't expect the figures for how much cultural heritage is outside of the global south to be as high as I later found out to be. So for example, in 2018, the French government commissioned a report and it found that over 90% of all of Africa's cultural and artistic heritage is held outside of Africa by major museums. And I want you to think about what I just said for a second, because Africa is home to 1.4 billion people and 54 countries. That's quite large. That's quite large. And in more recent years, well, more specifically in the last probably 15, 20 years, there's been a lot of talk about museums and object repatriation as countries like France, Great Britain, Belgium, Germany, Spain come to terms with their histories of imperialism. So, as that discussion has become progressively more mainstream, the two sides of the argument come up a lot, and I hope it's clear by the end of this presentation where I stand on this, but I'm sure many of you here already have your fair share of opinions. So the resistance to object repatriation takes a number of different forms. But the first, well, not the first, but one of the most famous public examples of object repatriation resistance was in 2010, when the then British Prime Minister David Cameron was asked about whether or not the UK would return the Kohinoor diamond, which for those of you that don't know is the diamond that's right smack in the middle of the, well, now the king's crown. Now originally comes from India. It was removed from India in 1850 and has been in possession by the British ever since. And ever since its removal, many in India have called for the return of the Kohinoor diamond, and the British have resisted virulently. And David Cameron, in response to that, said, if you say yes to one, you soon find that the British Museum will be empty. So I hope that gives people a rough image of the issue at hand here and of the questionable situation that this deals with. So I'm going to break this up actually into two parts. The first part I'm going to talk about is how antiquities ended up in museums in the past. And then the second part is going to be about the modern day market that keeps prestigious museums supplied with antiquities that's very much ongoing right now. But we'll start off with the past. So, it goes without saying that there were a lot of very famous artifacts throughout history that have made their way into large, prestigious museums through quote-unquote questionable, and I hope it's clear by my tone that term is doing a lot of heavy lifting circumstances. So a very famous example of stolen objects, and I do mean actually stolen, are the Benin bronzes. Now that term doesn't refer to one specific object. It refers to hundreds and hundreds of these bronze statues and reliefs and sculptures that were produced in the Kingdom of Benin in West Africa, which today is a part of Nigeria. So, short piece of history. In 1897, the British invaded the Kingdom of Benin and violently toppled the king, or the Oba, as it was called. And during that raid, British soldiers looted the palace of the King of Benin and took many hundreds of these Benin bronzes. They've since been scattered throughout the world to a variety of museums, but only 9 of those museums are actually in Nigeria. And ever since then, there have been calls for the repatriation of the Benin bronzes. So for now, the best part of 125 years. Another example, very famously, is a sculpture called the Bowe Queen, which originates in what is now Cameroon. It's held by the Dapper Foundation, which is a nonprofit artistic foundation, museum in Paris, in France. It was looted from Cameroon by the German army during a raid in 1899 and was bought by an art collector in Berlin in 1926, about 100 years ago. And to this day, it's still in the Dapper Foundation Museum in Paris. Another kind of difficult example of this is recently when the University of Aberdeen in Scotland was assessing objects from its museum's collection, they found this glass sphere that belonged to a Hindu holy man in India. And the story behind it was that the Hindu holy man was challenged to hold this sphere for 12 years in order to obtain a beneficial afterlife. But he only held it for 8 years. But it turned out that the University of Aberdeen not only had the sphere, but also his remains. And for those of you that don't know very much about Hinduism, Hindus are supposed to be cremated after death. So to hold on to this person's remains for now, it was the late 19th century, so for over 100 years, is deeply offensive. And the last very famous example is what's known as the Treasures of Tipu Sultan, which refers to again another vast array of objects from India. In 1799, after and I'm sure I'm pronouncing this wrong, so please bear with me, the Battle of Seringapatam, it's in southern India. British troops of the East India Company forcibly seized the palace of the Tipu Sultan and seized just about all of the treasures in the palace, including a very famous golden throne that's adorned with these, and I have pictures of it in just a second, these jeweled tiger heads. Very famous, very well-respected and symbol of southern India is the tiger. And they were these objects that were taken by the British were seen as valuable trophies and highly valuable artifacts. And the British took the throne apart and all the other pieces of art that they found in the palace apart. And they've also been scattered throughout the world to a variety of different museums. Very few of those are actually in India. So, here we are. Sorry, one second. There's a couple of examples that I wanted to bring up. This guy is one of several hundred Benin bronzes. This particular one is a relief sculpture. But Benin bronzes aren't just relief sculptures; they're also like statues. And there's, like I said, many hundreds of them. And what's particularly jarring about the story of the Benin bronzes is the loss of these artifacts wasn't just a physical loss. It was a cultural and historic loss as well, because in the Kingdom of Benin, bronzes were considered a form of record keeping by the Oba. So when they were taken from Benin City in 1897, it was in a way a form of ripping out pages of their history and erasing their records of their kingdom. There's another example of the Bowe sculpture that I told you about. This is currently at a museum in Paris. Also, it's been kind of used over the last number of years as a symbol of object repatriation. This, for those of you that have been to the British Museum, is a very famous artifact called the Rosetta Stone, taken from Egypt to the British Museum in the early 19th century. This helped French linguist Jean-François Champollion decipher not only ancient Greek but also ancient Egyptian and publish dictionaries of both languages. So by that time, historians then had a way of translating written records from the Ptolemaic period and even before the Ptolemaic period in ancient Egypt. But because this is such a artifact of great historical significance, as well as cultural one as well for the Egyptians, Ever since its removal about 200 years ago, Egypt has been adamant that they want it back. Same thing could be said about these. In the early 19th century, during the British occupation of Greece, an English earl named, oh crap, I can't remember what his first name was, Elgin, his last name was Elgin, hacked these marble reliefs off the walls of the Parthenon in Greece. And I just want to emphasize, these are about 2,000 years old. And they are currently in the British Museum. But if you ever go to Athens, to the Acropolis Museum, there's a wall where the wall where these marbles used to be. But what's filled into their spots are these reliefs that are a completely separate color. And it's very obvious that it's not original. But these were taken by the British in the early 19th century and placed in the British Museum, and understandably, ever since then, the Greeks have been adamant that they want these back, that they want these to be repatriated. And the last example that I'm going to give here in this lovely photo slide is this, one of many of the tigers of Tipu Sultan. So this was just one component of the throne of Tipu Sultan. The official throne itself was quite large. It was made mostly of gold and ivory, and adorned with many of these tiger sculptures. But after the British invaded the kingdom in 1799, they took the throne apart, and they sold each of the pieces of the throne separately. And ever since then, they've been scattered throughout the world to a variety of museums. So again, that's examples of how many antiquities came to museums in the past. So the question then remains, well, what's happened? Well, recently, governments like the French government, the British government, the Belgian government, and even the United States government as well, have found themselves under increasing pressure to return and repatriate artifacts that were stolen during their imperial times. And a number of museums have complied with this. I don't want it to seem like every single museum is resisting every effort to repatriate every object. That's not the case. There are examples of museums repatriating objects to their home countries, especially when it comes to those objects like the Benin bronzes or the pieces of the throne of Tipu Sultan. But the voices that oppose repatriation are loud. Depending on which country they come from, they might be in the minority, but they're still loud. And there are three common arguments that opponents of object repatriation give. So the first argument that you hear very commonly, especially when this is talked about on European news networks, is that these objects were acquired in a different time, and you can't judge history by the standards of modern day. Very famously, there's an art historian who was on what is essentially the French version of NBC, who was asked about what the French government should do about repatriating stolen African art. And he essentially said nothing. He essentially said that these were taken in a different time, and if you want to return objects taken in the 19th century, where does it end? And he also said that during the 19th century, looting objects might not have been moral, but it was perfectly legal. Whatever that means. The second argument that you often hear from repatriation opponents is that antiquities are often safer under the care of Western museums and institutions than they would be in their home countries. You hear that pretty commonly, especially when it comes to artifacts from Africa, but it comes up as well when talking about artifacts from South America and from India too. And the third argument that you often hear is that Western museums are open repositories of heritage that give everybody, everywhere, a chance to connect with cultures and people all over the world and their histories. Now, I hope it's clear, again, from my general tone and demeanor, that I find these arguments absurd. I hope that's clear? Good.
That's clearer than that.
That's good to hear. Because, here's my response to these. So, whenever someone says that antiquities were acquired in a different time, and it was okay to take culture's treasures at that time, my response is people knew that that practice was wrong even back then. And an example that I cite is there's a very famous raid by the British Army in northern Ethiopia in 1868, where the British brought along an expert from the British Museum to bid for some of the choicest items after the city was taken. And after that raid, the British Prime Minister at the time openly stated that he, and I quote, deeply lamented for the sake of everybody concerned that these objects were thought to be taken away by a British army, and he urged that they be held only until they could be restored. So, there were people in the 1800s who knew that taking cultural treasures from the countries that they invaded was wrong. They knew it was wrong. Whenever I hear people making the argument that artifacts are safer under the care of Western institutions than they would be in their home countries, I find that a little hard to take, considering that the caretaking records of certain institutions is a little questionable at best. I don't know if anybody remembers these objects here, the Parthenon marbles. But there was an incident in the mid-1930s where the British Museum actively damaged them by scrubbing the marbles with the wire brushes and a harsh cleaning agent. And if anybody knows anything about anything old, you do not do that. You will damage the sculptures. So I find that a little hard to take whenever I hear someone claim that antiquities are safer under the care of separate countries than they would be in their home countries. And my response to the third argument, that European and American museums are open repositories of heritage for everybody to access, that's not fundamentally wrong. But the thing is, it's only true that these are open repositories of heritage if you can get to the museums in question. And it's also worth noting, most museums only display a small fraction of their collections to the public at any given time. So, the Field Museum in Chicago, for example, only displays about 5% of its total collection to the public at any given time. And the British Museum in London, which has a collection of 8 million total objects, only displays 80,000 of them, just 1%, to the public at any given time. Not to mention, it can also be insulting for people to find out that treasures from their culture, which might be vibrant in present day, are locked away in these museum storage facilities. But no, not everybody gets to, I'm just going to use the example of Nigeria, because we were talking about the Benin bronzes. Not every Nigerian gets to fly to London to see treasures from the Kingdom of Benin. Not every Malian can fly to Paris to see treasures of Timbuktu in their museum. That's where the component of economics comes in. And I hope it's clear that I find that argument a little bit hard to take. So now we've talked a little bit about how antiquities ended up in museums in the past. I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about the modern day market for antiquities, because the practice of stealing and trafficking antiquities and cultural treasures is still very much ongoing to this day. Items are always being bought, sold, donated by art dealerships, private collectors, public museums. There's a whole network of antiquities trading. And the key word that I want people to understand here, sorry, where's the pointer? The key word that I want everybody to understand here is provenance. Provenance, very simply put, is the entire history of an object and the path that it took to end up in a museum on display to the public. It's not just how you know whether or not an object might be real or fake, but it's also how you know whether or not the object in question might have been stolen. So, one example, I'm just going to use a more recent example because, again, this practice is still very much ongoing. There's an auction house that's based in New York called Sotheby's. It's probably one of the biggest and most used antiquities dealer in the world. And, well, how do I put their history of dealing in stolen artifacts? Well, they've done it before. I'll leave it at that. It's happened. Not long ago, about 14 years ago, Sotheby's attempted to sell a Cambodian statue from the 11th century for about $3 million. But the expert that they brought in to appraise the statue for its value was very clear with them and said, this statue has been stolen. And Sotheby's went along with buying the object anyway and displaying it to the public until federal prosecutors eventually intervened and forced Sotheby's to return the statue to Cambodia. So I'm going to shift ahead a little bit. I'll show you a picture. This is the statue in question here. So you'll notice its hands and feet are missing. I'm going to go back just real quickly, but you'll notice that the hands and feet were missing from that statue. Why? Anybody want to guess?
They didn't fit the crate.
Okay, they didn't fit the crate. It's not quite what I was looking for, but okay. It's common to assume that statues missing feet or hands or even heads is just a result of damage due to time, but that's actually not the case. When a statue is missing its feet or hands or its head, it's a very common indicator that that statue has been stolen. Because looters or thieves will often hack off heads or hands to sell separately, or they will hack off the limbs from a temple wall or a location wall so rapidly that they leave the feet or hands or head behind. And I guarantee you, if this is public information for me, every auction house in New York and Paris and London definitely knows it. Definitely knows it. There's another very, very famous example of a museum finding out that it had participated in buying stolen antiquities was 7 years ago in 2018 at the Met Gala. Kim Kardashian took a picture in a very famous gold dress, like bright gold dress, next to an Egyptian sarcophagus, which was also gold. And there was the picture of it went viral, which means that it spread like jet fuel throughout the internet. But those viral photos allowed the Manhattan DA to identify the sarcophagus as a stolen artifact from one of their informants in Egypt. When they were questioned by federal prosecutors, the Met told authorities that they had bought the sarcophagus from an art dealer in Paris for $4 million. But the dealer gave the museum fraudulent paperwork. There were a number of red flags on their paperwork, including that the export license given said that the sarcophagus was from the, quote, Arab Republic of Egypt. If any of you know or have been following the news for the last 14 years, you will know that until after the Arab Spring, Egypt did not use that name.
Yeah, that's not true.
well, they didn't, it was, anyways, sorry, what was I saying? Yes, they didn't, they used a separate name on the paperwork so that the Met failed to identify as legitimate. It wasn't, they failed to use the name Arab Republic of Egypt. Sorry, my brain's going all over the place. So evidence later emerged that the Met was aware of these complicated provenance of the sarcophagus, and yet they took it anyway. They didn't see it as an ethical imperative to avoid buying a stolen artifact. And ever since then, the Met has actually had 9 search warrants executed on it, and a total of 37 of its objects have been seized and repatriated. So here are my photographic examples. Remember that statue I told you about from Cambodia? Well, that was it. And interestingly enough, this statue actually made the cover of the Met's, like one of their monthly newsletter for their members at the time, without I doubt most of its monthly readers ever knew that it was stolen. This is more recently. That's the very famous picture of Kim Kardashian in gold next to the Egyptian sarcophagus. But who knew that the concept of going viral would help identify stolen art? But there's a simple way to avoid situations like this, isn't there? Can anyone think of some kind of way that this could have been avoided?
You don't buy it.
Right? You do your due diligence. You look into the total history of the object. You trust the experts that you bring in to appraise your sarcophaguses or your statues. The Cambodian antiquities expert says, yeah, that statue's stolen. Well, it's probably not a bad idea to give them the benefit of the doubt. So, what's the harm? That's another question that often comes up here too, is if a museum buys, for example, a statue from Mesopotamia that was stolen during the invasion of Iraq in 2003, who is that hurting? Well, that's the thing. Trafficking looted antiquities isn't actually a victimless crime. It's helped finance some of the most egregious entities in recent history, like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria about 10 years ago. But the harm here also extends to the personal level too, because if there's one thing that I think could really be impressed from situations like these, is that when famous antiquities end up in the West, we put them behind glass. We call it art, right? But in their home countries, they're not just pieces of art. I've already given the example of the Benin bronze as being a system of record keeping, but another great example is this statue right here. Until 2022, this statue was in a museum in Dallas. It was just sitting in a nice glass case, open for the public to see at the Dallas Art Museum. But when it was finally returned to Nepal 3 years ago, it was immediately put back into use for religious ceremonies. So I wanted to bring that up to point out the callousness here, and to point out this isn't just about treasures, and this isn't just about countries and coming to terms with the history. This also extends down to people's personal views as well, and to people's individual beliefs. So what's the solution here? I'll give a few. One thing that museums could do, and what other countries could do, is they could have traveling exhibits. That happens all the time. Museums loan out their objects to other museums around the world on a very regular basis. But that's done with a very clear understanding of who those objects actually belong to. Artifact loans, same thing. Again, there needs to be a very rigid understanding of who actually owns objects in question here. Another thing that I thought of was maybe greater pressure could be put on museums to research provenance, to look into the history of the artifacts in their collection, because it's not just a marketing tool, it's very much an ethical imperative. So can anybody think of anything else? Nothing. All right. I will happily take some questions. I did say it was going to be a little bit shorter today, so I hope you don't mind the questions going around. But Lowell, yes.
I want to go back to the last slide.
This one? Sorry.
Your first bullet. The trade in antiquities has helped finance the Islamic State. The Islamic State, in fact, destroyed the majority of artifacts in Iraq because they were pre-Islamic. So to argue what was sold supported them to destroy their own heritage.
Indeed. And I would argue that's callous as well in its own way, right? Because
well, I mean, you can't argue both ways. You can't argue that if things go back home, they'll be safe, and from a generic point of view, given the fact that people don't respect their own heritage. The other thing I want to point out is the example you gave of the diamond going back to India. That diamond is not in the British Museum.
no, it's in their crown jewels.
So to say that sending that back would impact the British Museum, I think perhaps the estates will.
Well, you'll have to take that up with David Cameron.
It's in the King's Crown.
You'll have to take that up with David Cameron. He said that to the BBC.
That's fine. It's a different perspective.
Sure.
I think if you want to argue about things that belong back in the cultural heritage, then you need to make sure that what you're talking about is part of that cultural heritage. And, well, I disagree with that.
Okay. Yes, Catherine.
Is there contemporary international law that governs how this should be handled today?
There is, but the problem is a lot of countries don't have robust anti-trafficking infrastructure. So a very famous example of this is Nepal is a common source of South Asian art for museums like the Met or like the Rubin in New York. And getting an object from Nepal can be as simple as finding an art dealer who can forge paperwork. So very famously, there was an art dealer in the late 2000s named Subhash Kapoor, who was one of the Met's regular sources of South Asian art. And he was eventually identified as a prolific trafficker of stolen antiquities by federal prosecutors. But how he was able to get around their export laws was he was able to forge paperwork. And the Nepali police simply didn't have a way of verifying whether or not his paperwork was fraudulent. So in some of these countries, that there is an argument that a lot of trafficking is due to the poor infrastructure of their law enforcement system. I think there's some truth in that.
Western countries that are doing the buying,
Right.
they have the forensic capability of
Right. Well, that's
checking that kind of stuff.
Well, that's what these point out, but unfortunately there's a lot of examples of them not using that capability or misusing that capability.
Well, one thing on that point, there are UNESCO guidelines for the purchase of antiquities, but there's a cutoff date. And prior to that date, it's a different story.
Right.
That's why when you said the United Arab Republic, in fact, there was a United Arab Republic in the 1950s.
Right.
It was Egypt and Syria.
Right.
So if something came from that time period, if the sale was in that time period, it would be different
Right.
A sale in the 50s, I can't remember what the cutoff date is. But a sale
Different
in the
countries.
50s is different than a sale in the 70s or 90s.
Right, and different countries have different policies about exportation of their antiquities. I think in India specifically, they can't export anything that's more than 100 years old on paper. But again, there's ways to get around those laws using fraudulent paperwork. And a lot of these countries don't have the legal infrastructure to really circumvent those efforts. Yes, Al?
There's a parallel to some of this in North America. A lot of stuff was taken from the Indians, American Indians. I started seeing some of this in Mesa Verde National Park, probably late 1930s.
Okay.
And the Indians were just another species. They'd have their remains shown in a case, and I know there have been a lot of effort since then to restore some of these to the tribes and others, but it's been a pretty shaky business. And probably a lot of the objects are held by governmental institutions like the National Park Service.
Field Museum in Chicago has a huge Native American collection, but something that a lot of activists have tried to point out over the last 15, 20 years is that most of these artifacts aren't on display to the public at any given time. Most of them are in their refrigerated storage units.
I think that's missing the point
Is it?
about the role of museums. Because museums exist not only for public education, but for research.
True.
Those collections that are not available, quote unquote, in an exhibit may be being used by a researcher. And that's, I mean, what you see in a museum is a very small proportion selected by the curators.
Right.
But what is in the museum collection may in fact be the source of important information. Now the argument whether that information is important or not is a different argument. But if you think it's important for the advancement of science, then the maintenance of those collections, even if 10% of it only is exhibited, you've got a large corpus of information for research.
Indeed. I know that different tribes feel differently about.
I gave that talk.
Right. No, and Lowell makes a lot of really good points. This issue isn't cut and dry. Various different countries and various different groups of people have their own opinions about object repatriation. I think Lowell makes a really good point. You probably shouldn't see this in terms of black and white. Anybody else? Yes, no.
Well, I forgot the exact name, but there's a skeleton washed out of the Columbia that became a real controversy, and even taking a little sample of the bone was sacrilege to some of the tribes, even though they could not prove direct ancestry to the skeleton.
I believe you're referring to Kennewick Man?
Right.
Yeah.
I know that until recently, Kennewick Man was in the Burke Museum.
He's now reburied.
Yes, he's not there anymore. I do remember that controversy coming up. It wasn't that long ago, maybe 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. But yeah, again, different groups of people, different museums have different policies when it comes to, especially I think human remains are also, that's a whole separate issue because human remains have different cultural significances for different groups of people as well. So that was part of that issue that I brought up with that Hindu holy man corpse at that museum in Scotland. Anyone else?
Thank you,
All right, I think I'm going to call it. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.